In the autumn of 1866, in the heart of Reconstruction-era Mississippi, the town of Coldwater existed as little more than a collection of weathered buildings and broken dreams. The war had left its mark on everything. The cotton fields lay fallow, the courthouse bore bullet scars, and the people moved through their days with the haunted expressions of those who had seen too much death. But what the residents of Coldwater didn't know was that the worst horrors were yet to come, and they would arrive in the form of salvation itself, a doctor named Jeremiah Black. Dr. Black arrived on a humid September evening, his black medical bag in one hand and a leather-bound journal in the other. He was tall and gaunt, with pale skin that seemed to have never seen the Mississippi sun, and eyes so dark they appeared bottomless. The townspeople, desperate for medical care after years of war, had left them without a proper physician, welcomed him with open arms. They didn't ask where he came from, they didn't question his credentials. They were simply grateful that someone, anyone, had come to help them in their time of need. Within weeks, Dr. Black had established his practice in an old colonial house on the edge of town. The building had once belonged to a plantation owner who died during the siege of Vicksburg, and it stood isolated among ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss. The locals thought it peculiar that he chose such a remote location, but Black explained it away easily enough. He needed space for his patients to recover in peace, away from the noise and chaos of the town center. What they couldn't see were the locked rooms on the second floor. What they couldn't hear were the sounds that emanated from the basement in the dead of night. What they couldn't know was that Dr. Jeremiah Black had not come to Coldwater to heal. He had come to feed. This is the story of how one man's twisted brilliance turned a town's hope into its darkest nightmare, and how the truth, once buried in those banned files, would reveal horrors that defied every law of medicine and morality. Dr. Jeremiah Black's first patient in Coldwater was a young woman named Sarah Mitchell. She was 23 years old, recently widowed by the war, and suffering from what the townspeople called consumption. She had been coughing blood for weeks, growing thinner by the day, and her mother, Eleanor Mitchell, had nearly given up hope when word spread that a doctor had finally arrived in town. Eleanor brought Sarah to Black's practice on a cool October morning. The house loomed before them, its white paint peeling in long strips, revealing the grey wood beneath. The windows were tall and narrow, like suspicious eyes watching their approach. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine, but she pushed the feeling aside. Her daughter was dying, and this man was their only chance. Black answered the door himself. There was no nurse, no assistant, just the doctor dressed in an impeccable black suit despite the heat. His smile was thin and professional as he ushered them inside. The interior of the house was surprisingly well appointed. Heavy curtains blocked most of the sunlight, and oil lamps cast flickering shadows across walls lined with medical texts and anatomical diagrams. The air smelled of carbolic acid and something else Eleanor couldn't quite identify, something sweet and slightly rotten, like overripe fruit. Black examined Sarah in what had once been the plantation house's drawing room, now converted into an examination space. He listened to her lungs with his stethoscope, took her pulse, examined her eyes and throat. His hands were cold, Eleanor noticed, unnaturally cold for such a warm day. When he finished, he sat back and folded his hands, his expression grave. "Your daughter is very ill," he said, his voice soft and measured. "The consumption has progressed further than I would have hoped. However, I believe I can help her. I have developed certain treatments during my years of study, techniques not yet widely known in the medical community. They are unconventional, perhaps, but effective." Eleanor leaned forward, desperate. "Will she live?" "If she undergoes my full course of treatment, yes, but she must stay here under my direct supervision. The treatment requires constant monitoring, day and night. I cannot guarantee success if she returns home between sessions." Sarah, weak and pale on the examination table, looked at her mother with frightened eyes. Eleanor hesitated. Every instinct told her something was wrong, that leaving her daughter alone with this strange man in this isolated house was a terrible idea. But then Sarah coughed again, a wet, rattling sound, and blood flecked her lips. Eleanor's resolve crumbled. "How long will the treatment take, Pa?" she asked. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. It depends on how she responds." Eleanor agreed. What choice did she have? She helped Sarah upstairs to one of the patient rooms, a small clean space with a single bed, a washstand, and barred windows that Black explained were necessary to prevent confused patients from wandering outside during fever dreams. Eleanor kissed her daughter goodbye, promised to visit daily, and left with a heavy heart. That night, after Eleanor had gone and the town had settled into sleep, Dr. Black returned to Sarah's room. She was resting fitfully, her breathing labored and painful. He sat beside her bed and opened his leather journal, the one he had carried with him from the north. Its pages were filled with meticulous notes, diagrams, and observations written in his precise hand. He turned to a blank page and began to write. Subject 17, female, age 23, advanced pulmonary tuberculosis, weight approximately 95 pounds, beginning initial preparation. He set down his pen and removed a small vial from his coat pocket. The liquid inside was clear and slightly luminescent in the lamplight. Black had spent years perfecting this formula, this breakthrough that the medical establishment had called madness when he presented it to them in Philadelphia. They had stripped him of his medical license, banned his research, and driven him out of the city. But they were fools. They couldn't see what he saw, that the human body was not just a machine to be repaired, but a resource to be utilized, a source of vital energies that could be harvested and redirected. He had discovered that certain compounds, when introduced into a diseased body, would accelerate the body's consumption of its own tissues. The disease would feed more rapidly, yes, but in doing so, it would concentrate certain biological essences, proteins, enzymes, cellular materials, that Black had learned to extract and process. These essences, when properly refined, had remarkable properties. They could strengthen the body, sharpen the mind, slow the aging process. They could, in effect, transfer vitality from the dying to the living, from the sick to the doctor. Black administered the first dose to Sarah that night, mixing it into a glass of water and helping her drink. She was too weak to question it. Within hours, her body would begin the transformation, though she wouldn't understand what was happening. The disease would intensify, consuming her from within, but in a controlled, directed manner. And as it did, Black would be there to collect what he needed. He looked at Sarah's pale face and felt nothing. No guilt, no remorse. In his mind, he was a pioneer, pushing the boundaries of medical science into territory others were too timid to explore. If his methods required sacrifice, so be it. Progress always demanded a price, and he had long ago decided that he was not the one who would pay it. Eleanor Mitchell arrived at Black's practice every morning for the next week, carrying fresh bread, clean linens, and a mother's desperate hope. Each time, Black met her at the door with updates delivered in his calm, clinical manner. Sarah was responding to treatment, he said. Her fever had broken, her cough was improving. She was sleeping peacefully and shouldn't be disturbed. Eleanor accepted these explanations, though she noticed that Black never let her see Sarah directly. There were always reasons. Sarah was sleeping. Sarah was undergoing a delicate treatment phase. Sarah needed absolute rest without emotional disruption. By the 8th day, Eleanor's patience had worn thin. She arrived at the practice earlier than usual, just after dawn, hoping to catch Black before he could turn her away. She knocked on the heavy front door, but no one answered. She knocked again, louder this time, and when there was still no response, she tried the handle. The door swung open. The house was silent except for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Eleanor stepped inside, her heart pounding. "Dr. Black?" she called. "Sarah." No answer. She moved through the dim rooms, past the examination space, toward the stairs that led to the patient rooms. As she climbed, she heard something, a low, rhythmic sound, like machinery or perhaps labored breathing. It was coming from the second floor. The door to Sarah's room was slightly ajar. Eleanor pushed it open and froze. Sarah lay on the bed, but she looked nothing like the girl Eleanor had left 8 days ago. Her skin had taken on a grayish hue, stretched tight over bones that seemed to protrude at sharper angles. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and strange bruises covered her arms, dark purple marks that formed geometric patterns, as if something had been systematically draining her. Beside the bed stood an apparatus Eleanor had never seen before, a glass and metal contraption connected to Sarah's arm by rubber tubing. Dark red fluid slowly dripped from Sarah's vein into a collection jar. Eleanor screamed. She rushed to her daughter's side, pulling at the tubes, trying to disconnect the horrible machine. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. "Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What has he done to you?" Eleanor sobbed, cradling Sarah's skeletal face. "What has that monster done?" She heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy, deliberate. Dr. Black appeared in the doorway, his expression annoyed rather than surprised. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said coolly, "you weren't supposed to be here this early." "You're killing her!" Eleanor shrieked. "You're draining the life out of my daughter." Black sighed and stepped into the room. "I'm treating her, Mrs. Mitchell. You simply don't understand the complexities of modern medical science. What you see appears disturbing, I grant you, but it's a necessary part of the therapeutic process. The old blood must be removed so new, healthy blood can replace it." "Liar! She's dying. Anyone can see that." Black's expression hardened. "You're becoming hysterical. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. If you cannot trust my methods, you're welcome to take your daughter home, though I warn you she'll be dead within days without my continued care." Eleanor looked at Sarah's ravaged face, then at Black's cold eyes, and understood with terrible clarity what was happening. This man wasn't healing her daughter. He was using her for some twisted purpose she couldn't begin to comprehend. She had to get Sarah out of this house, had to get help, had to tell someone what she had seen. "I'm taking her," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Right now, I'm taking my daughter home." Black moved with surprising speed. He was between Eleanor and the door before she could react, blocking her path. "I'm afraid I can't allow that, Mrs. Mitchell. Sarah is in a critical phase of treatment. Moving her now would be fatal. And besides," his smile was terrible to behold, "you've seen too much. You understand too much. That makes you a complication I cannot afford." Eleanor backed away, pulling Sarah's frail body against her. "People know I'm here. If something happens to us, they'll come looking." "Will they?" Black tilted his head, considering. A grieving widow and her dying daughter, lost to consumption like so many others in these desperate times. "I think not, Mrs. Mitchell." "I think the people of Coldwater will be very sad, but entirely unsurprised, when I inform them that despite my best efforts, you both succumbed to the same disease that has claimed so many. They'll praise me for trying, perhaps even pay me for my troubles." He advanced toward them. Eleanor screamed again, but the house was isolated, surrounded by empty fields and ancient trees. No one would hear. She grabbed the oil lamp from Sarah's bedside table and hurled it at Black. He dodged, and the lamp shattered against the wall, spilling burning oil across the wooden floor. Flames leaped up immediately, hungry and bright. Black cursed and stumbled backward as fire spread across the dry floorboards. Eleanor seized the moment. She gathered Sarah in her arms, the girl weighed almost nothing now, and stumbled toward the door. Black tried to grab her, but the flames had created a barrier between them. Eleanor ran down the stairs, her daughter's body limp in her arms, while behind her Black shouted and the fire roared louder. She burst out the front door into the grey dawn light and ran. She ran down the dirt road toward town, her lungs burning, her arms aching. Sarah's shallow breathing the only sound that mattered. Behind her, smoke began to pour from the upper windows of Black's practice. She didn't look back. She just ran, praying she would reach help before Black could follow, praying her daughter would survive long enough to be saved by someone, anyone, who wasn't a monster wearing a doctor's face. By the time she reached the center of Coldwater, the sun had risen fully, and people were emerging from their homes. They saw Eleanor, wild-eyed and covered in soot, carrying her dying daughter. They saw the smoke rising from the direction of Black's practice, and they began to understand that something had gone terribly wrong with the doctor they had welcomed so eagerly into their broken town. The town sheriff, Thomas Hayward, was a Confederate veteran who had returned to Coldwater with one arm and a permanent limp. He listened to Eleanor Mitchell's frantic story with growing horror, watching as the town's only other woman with medical knowledge, a midwife named Ruth Cooper, examined Sarah in the back room of the general store. When Ruth emerged, her face was pale and troubled. "That girl needs a real hospital," Ruth said quietly. "I've never seen anything like what's been done to her. There are needle marks all over her arms and legs. arranged in patterns like someone was mapping her veins. She's severely anemic, malnourished and delirious. Whatever that man was doing to her, it wasn't healing. Sheriff Hayward organized a group of men and rode out to Black's practice. The fire Eleanor had started had been contained to one room. Black had apparently extinguished it quickly, but when they arrived, the house stood empty. Black's medical equipment remained. His books lined the shelves, but the doctor himself had vanished. His black medical bag was gone. So was his leather journal. What they found instead turned their stomachs. In the locked rooms on the second floor, they discovered 4 more patients, all in states similar to Sarah's, emaciated, covered in strange bruise patterns, connected to glass and metal apparatus that seemed designed to extract blood and other fluids. 3 were barely conscious. 1 had already died, her body cold but not yet stiff, suggesting she had passed within the last few hours. In the basement, they found Black's true laboratory. Glass beakers and tubes covered long tables. Shelves held dozens of jars filled with dark red fluids, each labeled with numbers and dates. There were notebooks filled with meticulous observations written in Black's precise hand, documenting the progression of various diseases in his subjects and the quantities of biological materials he had extracted from each. The men who descended into that basement emerged shaken, several of them vomiting in the yard outside. But most disturbing was what they found hidden behind a false wall in the basement's far corner. A small room, no larger than a closet, containing a cot, a wash basin, and another collection of jars. These jars, however, were filled not with blood, but with a clear, slightly luminous liquid. Next to them sat syringes and a small mirror. On the cot lay an empty vial and a note in Black's handwriting. Daily dose 5 milliliters. Effects: enhanced vigor, reduced fatigue, improved mental acuity, cellular degradation in subjects reaching optimal levels. Sheriff Hayward stared at the note and felt cold understanding settle over him. Black hadn't just been extracting materials from his patients. He had been refining those materials into something he could use himself. A formula derived from their dying bodies that somehow sustained or enhanced his own health. The man had been feeding on his patients in the most literal sense possible, parasitically drawing life from the sick to strengthen himself. The surviving patients were transported to Ruth Cooper's home, where she and several other women worked to stabilize them. Eleanor refused to leave Sarah's side, sitting vigil through the days and nights that followed. Slowly, with proper food and rest and clean water, Sarah began to recover. Her color improved, her weight gradually increased, and the terrible bruises faded. But she remembered nothing of her time in Black's care. The trauma, or perhaps something Black had given her, had wiped those weeks from her memory. Eleanor was grateful for that small mercy. The town buried the woman who had died, a former school teacher named Margaret Dawson, whose family had brought her to Black, hoping he could cure her scarlet fever. Her death was the first of many that would eventually be attributed to the doctor. As word spread through the county and beyond, other families came forward with stories of loved ones who had gone to Dr. Black for treatment and never recovered, who had died under mysterious circumstances while in his care. Sheriff Hayward contacted authorities in Jackson, Mississippi's capital, and then in Memphis, and eventually in Philadelphia, where records showed Jeremiah Black had once been a licensed physician. What he learned painted a portrait of a brilliant but disturbed man who had graduated top of his medical school class before becoming obsessed with what he called vital essence transfer. Black had proposed to the Philadelphia Medical Society that diseases could be harnessed as tools to concentrate biological materials that had therapeutic properties. When the society reviewed his research and found evidence that he had been experimenting on terminal patients without consent, they stripped his license and banned him from practicing medicine. But they hadn't been thorough enough. They had taken his license and destroyed his reputation in the North, but they hadn't stopped him. They had simply driven him underground, sent him south, where the chaos of Reconstruction meant fewer questions would be asked, and desperate people would accept any doctor who offered hope. For 3 years, Black had moved from town to town across the devastated South, leaving a trail of victims wherever he went. Coldwater was merely his latest hunting ground. Now, with his practice exposed and his crimes undeniable, Black had fled into the vast Mississippi wilderness. Sheriff Hayward organized search parties, but the forests and swamps of the region were endless, and Black had a significant head start. Days passed, then weeks. Some claimed they had seen a tall, gaunt figure moving through the trees at dusk. Others reported finding abandoned campsites with medical equipment scattered about. But Black himself remained elusive, a ghost haunting the edges of civilization. The question that plagued everyone was not just where he had gone, but what he would do next. A man like Black, deprived of his practice and his source of patients, would not simply give up his twisted research. He would find another way to continue. He would find new victims, and without his laboratory and equipment, he might become even more desperate, even more dangerous. 3 months after Jeremiah Black's disappearance, strange reports began emerging from the rural settlements scattered throughout northern Mississippi. Families living in isolated farmsteads spoke of a traveling doctor who appeared at their doors offering free medical examinations and treatments. He called himself Dr. James White and claimed to be working for a charitable organization dedicated to bringing medical care to the poor. He was thin and pale, they said, with unusually cold hands and eyes so dark they seemed to have no bottom. The descriptions matched Black too closely to be coincidence. Sheriff Hayward sent warnings to every town and settlement within 100 miles, but in the sprawling, disorganized landscape of post-war Mississippi, communication was slow and unreliable. By the time his warnings reached many communities, Black had already passed through, leaving death in his wake. A freed slave family living near the Tennessee border reported that Dr. White had treated their elderly grandmother for pneumonia. She had seemed to improve initially, then deteriorated rapidly, dying within a week. When relatives examined her body before burial, they found the same strange bruise patterns that Sarah Mitchell had displayed, geometric marks suggesting systematic extraction. But they were too poor and too marginalized to pursue justice, and by the time anyone with authority learned of the death, Black had moved on. In a small settlement called Pine Ridge, Black stayed for 2 weeks in an abandoned mill house, treating various ailments and gradually selecting the patients he wanted for his real work. A young man with typhoid fever was one. A woman with chronic consumption was another. Both went missing after receiving Black's special treatments, their bodies eventually discovered in the mill house's basement, desiccated and marked with evidence of Black's procedures. The man who found them, a local farmer, burned the mill house to the ground in horror, destroying whatever evidence might have led to Black's capture. Hayward became obsessed with catching Black. The doctor's crimes had occurred in his jurisdiction, had victimized people he had sworn to protect. Night after night, he pored over reports and maps, trying to predict where Black might surface next. The pattern he eventually discerned was both logical and chilling. Black was moving toward the most isolated, vulnerable communities he could find. Places where people were too desperate or too disconnected to question a doctor's methods, where death was common enough that a few more victims might go unnoticed. In early February 1867, Hayward received a telegram from a U.S. Marshal named Daniel Foster, who had taken interest in the case. Foster had been tracking a series of unusual deaths across 3 states and had concluded that all were the work of the same man. He was coordinating with other lawmen to set up a network of informants and lookouts, creating a web that would, theoretically, trap Black when he next emerged to find victims. Foster was arriving in Coldwater to personally oversee the operation. Marshal Foster was a younger man than Hayward expected, perhaps 35, with sharp eyes and a methodical approach to investigation. He brought with him a file containing everything known about Jeremiah Black, his medical training, his family history, his published papers before his disgrace, testimonies from colleagues who had known him in Philadelphia. Foster laid it all out on Hayward's desk, like pieces of a puzzle. The key to understanding Black, Foster explained, is recognizing that he genuinely believes he's doing important work. In his mind, he's a misunderstood genius who will eventually be vindicated. The patients who die are regrettable but necessary sacrifices for the advancement of medical science. He's not a murderer in his own eyes, he's a researcher. That doesn't make him any less dangerous, Hayward replied. No, but it helps us predict his behavior. A man who sees himself as a scientist will keep records, document his findings, preserve his research. He lost his laboratory and most of his equipment when he fled Coldwater, which means he's working with limited resources and probably experiencing setbacks. That will frustrate him, make him more reckless. He'll need to establish a new base of operations somewhere, a place where he can work undisturbed for extended periods. Foster's theory proved correct sooner than anyone expected. In mid-February, a report came from a remote area near the Mississippi-Alabama border. A traveler had discovered an old hunting cabin deep in the woods, smoke rising from its chimney despite the property being supposedly abandoned. When local men investigated, they found the cabin occupied and heavily modified. Someone had reinforced the doors and windows, covered the windows with dark cloth, and installed a wood-burning stove connected to various glass tubes and beakers. A makeshift laboratory cobbled together from scavenged materials. Inside, they found Black's leather journal, left open on a table. The most recent entries detailed his frustration with working in primitive conditions and his plans to move further west, perhaps to Texas, where the frontier settlements would provide endless opportunities for a doctor willing to ask no questions and expect none in return. But the journal also contained something else, a complete record of every patient Black had treated, including those he had secretly used for his experiments. Names, dates, observations, and outcomes were all meticulously documented. It was a comprehensive confession, written in Black's own hand, never intended to be seen by others but invaluable now as evidence of his crimes. Black himself was not in the cabin when it was discovered. Signs suggested he had left in a hurry, perhaps warned by some instinct that his hiding place had been compromised, but he had made a fatal mistake in leaving his journal behind. For a man who prided himself on his meticulous record-keeping and scientific rigor, abandoning that documentation must have been agonizing. It suggested that he had been more desperate than anyone realized, that his situation had deteriorated to the point where even his precious research had to be sacrificed for the sake of escape. Marshal Foster secured the journal and all other materials from the cabin, declaring them official evidence in a federal investigation. He also made copies of the journal's contents and distributed them to newspapers throughout the region. Within weeks, Black's face was known from Mississippi to Louisiana, from Arkansas to Georgia. His crimes were publicized in detail, his victims' names honored, his methods exposed. He had become the most wanted man in the South, and every lawman, bounty hunter, and concerned citizen was watching for him. The pressure was immense and inescapable. Black could no longer move openly, could no longer present himself as a doctor seeking to help the needy. His face was too recognizable, his methods too well known. He had become a hunted animal, forced ever deeper into the wilderness, cut off from the resources and victims he needed to continue his work. For a man driven by an obsession with medical research, it must have been unbearable. By March of 1867, Jeremiah Black had become a phantom. Sightings were reported almost daily, but none could be confirmed. A doctor matching his description was seen boarding a steamboat in Natchez, then simultaneously reported treating patients in a remote Arkansas settlement. The man had become legend, his actual whereabouts obscured by rumor and fear. Parents used his name to frighten misbehaving children. The sick hesitated to seek medical care, worried that any unfamiliar physician might be Black in disguise. Marshal Foster established his headquarters in Coldwater, using the town as a central point for coordinating the search. He interviewed survivors of Black's treatment, studied the journal entries obsessively, and consulted with medical experts trying to understand the scientific basis of Black's methods. What he learned disturbed him deeply. Black's theories, while twisted and unethical, were not entirely without merit. Several doctors admitted privately that Black's observations about disease progression and cellular breakdown contained insights that could potentially advance medical knowledge, if pursued through legitimate research rather than murderous experimentation. Sarah Mitchell had recovered enough to speak with Foster about her experience. She sat in her mother's parlor, wrapped in blankets despite the warming spring weather, and struggled to remember details her mind had tried to bury. "He was kind at first," she said softly. "He spoke gently, explained everything he was doing. But then the treatment started, and there was pain, so much pain. He would inject me with something that made me feel like my blood was burning. And he was always writing in that book, watching me like I was an insect under glass rather than a person." "Did he ever speak about his work?" Foster asked. About what he was trying to accomplish? Sarah nodded slowly. Once, when I was barely conscious, I heard him talking to himself. He said something about unlocking the body's hidden resources, about how disease was merely a tool for transformation. He said that death was wasteful, that the dying possessed concentrated essences that shouldn't be lost. He believed he was being efficient, using what would otherwise be discarded. The callousness of that philosophy chilled Foster. Black had reduced human beings to raw materials, their suffering and death merely steps in a process he considered scientifically valuable. It was a corruption of medical practice so profound that Foster wondered if Black had ever truly understood the purpose of healing, or if he had always viewed medicine as simply a means to access vulnerable subjects for experimentation. Eleanor Mitchell, listening from across the room, spoke up. "Will you catch him, Marshall? Will he ever face justice for what he did to my Sarah and all those others?" Foster chose his words carefully. "I believe we will, Mrs. Mitchell. Men like Black make mistakes. They're driven by obsession, which makes them both dangerous and predictable. He can't stop himself from continuing his research, and that compulsion will eventually lead us to him." Indeed, Foster's prediction began to materialize in late March. A pattern emerged from the scattered reports. Black was moving steadily westward, staying ahead of the search parties but leaving traces of his passage. A traveling merchant reported selling medical supplies to a pale, gaunt man near the Louisiana border. A frontier preacher described encountering a doctor camping in the woods, who asked strangely detailed questions about which families in nearby settlements had sick members. Each sighting was investigated, each lead followed, gradually tightening the net around Black. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a former medical colleague of Black's from Philadelphia. A doctor named Harrison Webb contacted Foster after reading about the case in a northern newspaper. Webb had maintained correspondence with Black in the months before his disgrace, and those letters revealed something crucial. Black had a brother living in Texas, a rancher named Caleb Black who owned property in the remote hill country west of San Antonio. Webb believed that if Black was truly moving westward, his brother's ranch would be his ultimate destination. Foster immediately telegraphed authorities in Texas, providing descriptions and warnings. Texas Rangers began monitoring the routes leading to Caleb Black's property. Within 2 weeks, they reported success. A man matching Jeremiah Black's description had been spotted purchasing supplies in a small town called Fredericksburg, asking for directions to the hill country ranches. The Rangers moved to intercept him, setting up checkpoints on the main roads and sending scouts into the backcountry to watch for anyone traveling cross-country. On April 4, 1867, Texas Rangers surrounded a small line cabin on the edge of Caleb Black's ranch property. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a horse stood tethered outside. They called for the occupant to emerge with hands visible. After a long silence, the cabin door opened, and Jeremiah Black stepped into the late afternoon sunlight, blinking like a creature unaccustomed to brightness. He was thinner than his description suggested, his suit hanging loosely on his frame, his face haggard with exhaustion and deprivation, but his eyes still held that cold, analytical quality that survivors had described. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, as if greeting colleagues at a medical conference rather than armed lawmen, "I assume you're here regarding the misunderstandings in Mississippi. I assure you, everything can be explained if we discuss this rationally." The Rangers placed him in irons. They searched the cabin and found another makeshift laboratory, less sophisticated than the one in Coldwater, but functional enough for basic work. There were notebooks filled with recent observations, vials of extracted fluids, and equipment clearly taken from his brother's ranch. Most damning were 2 recent victims, a drifter and a ranch hand, both in the early stages of Black's treatment protocol, both bearing the telltale bruise patterns and showing signs of systematic extraction. They were alive but barely, and the Rangers immediately summoned medical help. Black was transported to San Antonio under heavy guard. Marshal Foster traveled from Mississippi to take custody, determined to see this case through to its conclusion. When the 2 men finally met face to face in the San Antonio jail, Foster was struck by Black's complete lack of remorse. The doctor seemed annoyed by his capture, frustrated that his research had been interrupted, but showed no recognition that his actions had been criminal or immoral. The trial of Jeremiah Black began in Jackson, Mississippi in June of 1867. The prosecution had compiled overwhelming evidence: Black's own journal, testimony from surviving victims, physical evidence from multiple crime scenes, and statements from medical experts condemning his methods as both scientifically unsound and morally reprehensible. The case should have been straightforward, but Black's defense attorney, a shrewd lawyer named Marcus Finch, mounted an unexpected strategy. Finch argued that Black was insane, incapable of distinguishing right from wrong due to his obsessive fixation on medical research. He brought in alienists, early psychiatrists, who testified that Black exhibited symptoms of monomania, the condition in which an otherwise rational mind becomes completely consumed by a single irrational idea. Black's meticulous record-keeping, his methodical approach, and his genuine belief in the scientific value of his work all supported this interpretation. If the jury accepted the insanity defense, Black would be committed to an asylum rather than executed, potentially preserving his life. The prosecution countered with testimony demonstrating Black's full awareness of societal norms and legal boundaries. He had hidden his activities, lied to patients and families, and fled when discovered, all actions indicating he knew his behavior was wrong and would be punished if exposed. His intelligence and medical training proved he possessed the capacity for moral reasoning, even if he chose to ignore it in pursuit of his research goals. Sarah Mitchell took the stand, her testimony powerful and emotional. She described the trust she had placed in Black, the betrayal she felt upon discovering his true intentions, and the lasting trauma his treatment had caused. He knew exactly what he was doing, she said, her voice steady despite visible distress. He looked me in the eyes and lied. He promised healing while planning to use me for experiments. That's not madness. That's evil, disguised as science. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Newspapers throughout the country covered it extensively, turning Black into a symbol of medical ethics violations and the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. Editorial writers debated whether his research, however obtained, might contain genuine insights worth preserving. Medical journals published articles condemning Black while simultaneously analyzing his theories, creating uncomfortable conversations about where the line between innovative research and human experimentation should be drawn. Black himself remained eerily calm throughout the proceedings. He listened to testimony with detached interest, occasionally taking notes, sometimes nodding as if approving of particularly accurate descriptions of his methods. When finally given opportunity to speak in his own defense, he delivered a lengthy statement that chilled everyone present. "I stand before you accused of murder," he began, his voice clear and confident. "But I submit that you misunderstand the nature of my work. Every patient I treated was already dying. The diseases consuming them were irreversible and fatal. I did not create their suffering. Nature did. What I accomplished was giving meaning to their inevitable deaths. Through my research, their bodies contributed to advancing medical knowledge that will eventually save countless lives. Yes, I accelerated their deaths in some cases, but I also ensured those deaths served a greater purpose." He paused, scanning the courtroom with those bottomless dark eyes. "You call me a monster, but I am simply a man willing to make difficult decisions that softer minds refuse to contemplate. Medicine progresses through experimentation, and experimentation requires subjects. Would you prefer I use healthy volunteers? Society finds that unconscionable, so I worked with those already condemned by disease, extracting knowledge from the dying that the living might benefit. Future generations will understand what I attempted here, even if this age lacks the courage to appreciate it." The speech was met with horrified silence. Even Finch seemed taken aback by Black's complete failure to express remorse or acknowledge wrongdoing. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict, guilty on all counts, including multiple charges of murder, assault, and practicing medicine without a valid license. The insanity defense had failed completely. Whatever psychological peculiarities Black possessed, the jury determined he had been fully aware of his actions and their illegality. Judge Henry Morrison sentenced Black to death by hanging, the execution scheduled for August 15th. Morrison's statement from the bench was scathing. "Dr. Black, You have perverted the noble profession of medicine into an instrument of torture and death. You have violated the most sacred trust that exists between physician and patient. Your intelligence makes your crimes worse, not better, because you knew precisely what you were doing and chose to do it anyway. You speak of advancing science, but true science is built on ethical foundations that you have utterly rejected. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court has none. Black was remanded to the Mississippi State Penitentiary in Jackson to await execution. Even there, he continued his work in whatever limited ways remained available. Guards reported that he had somehow obtained paper and writing implements, filling page after page with medical observations and theories. He dissected insects and small animals that found their way into his cell, conducting crude experiments and documenting results. His obsession consumed him entirely, occupying every moment until the very end. Marshal Foster visited Black once before the execution, hoping to extract information about other potential victims or accomplices. Black received him cordially, offering tea as if they were meeting in a gentleman's study rather than a prison cell. When Foster asked his questions, Black smiled thinly. There were others, Marshal, many others across multiple states over several years, but I see no reason to provide you with their names or locations. My research is my legacy, and I'll not have it entirely destroyed by those too ignorant to appreciate its value. Let future investigators discover what I've done. Let them piece together the full scope of my work. Perhaps then they'll understand the magnitude of what I nearly achieved. Foster left the prison feeling frustrated and disturbed. Black would take secrets to his grave, leaving questions that might never be answered, and victims whose families would never know the truth. On August 15, 1867, Jeremiah Black was led to the gallows erected in the prison courtyard. A crowd had gathered. Journalists, medical professionals, victims' families, and curious citizens who had followed the sensational trial. Security was heavy, with armed guards positioned throughout the area, though no one expected trouble. Black had no supporters, no one to mount a rescue or create a disturbance. He was utterly alone in his final moments. Black walked steadily, showing no fear or distress. He had refused religious counsel, stating that he had no use for superstitions and preferred to face death with the same rational clarity he had brought to his life's work. As he climbed the gallows steps, he carried himself with an odd dignity, as if this were merely another phase in a grand experiment. The warden offered Black a final opportunity to speak. Most condemned men use this moment for apologies, confessions, or final prayers. Black characteristically chose differently. He surveyed the crowd with those dark, analytical eyes and delivered one last statement that would be recorded and debated for years afterward. "I regret nothing," he said clearly. "I pursued knowledge that others lacked the courage to seek. I crossed boundaries that others feared to approach. History will judge whether my methods were justified, but history will also benefit from the discoveries I made. The essence transfer techniques I developed represent genuine breakthroughs in understanding human biology. My journal contains observations that will eventually revolutionize medicine once minds more advanced than those present here can properly interpret them." He paused, and something like a smile crossed his face. "You execute me today, but you cannot execute my ideas. They will survive in those journals, in the minds of doctors who read them, in the questions my work raises. Someone, someday, will continue what I began. Scientific progress cannot be halted by hangman's nooses." With that, he nodded to the executioner, indicating he was ready. The hood was placed over his head, the noose positioned, and at precisely 9 in the morning, the trap door opened. Jeremiah Black dropped, his neck breaking instantly. The official doctor present confirmed death within minutes. The body was cut down, placed in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, and covered quickly. No monument marked the spot. No family claimed him. He simply ceased to exist, erased as thoroughly as the law could manage. But Black's final words proved prophetic in unexpected ways. His journals, seized as evidence during the trial, were placed in the custody of the Mississippi State Medical Board, with instructions that they remain sealed indefinitely. However, copies had been made during the trial for presentation to the jury, and those copies circulated among medical professionals despite official prohibitions. Doctors read them with horrified fascination, recognizing that Black's observations, however unethically obtained, contained genuine insights into disease progression, blood chemistry, and cellular processes. A few physicians working in secret attempted to replicate Black's legitimate findings using ethical methods and animal subjects. Some of his theories about concentrated biological essences proved accurate. Diseases did cause certain proteins and enzymes to concentrate in specific ways, and these concentrations could potentially be detected and measured for diagnostic purposes. Black had been correct about that fundamental observation, even if his methods for exploiting it were monstrous. Within a decade, legitimate researchers developed new blood tests based partly on principles Black had discovered, though they would never publicly acknowledge the connection. The irony was bitter. Black's victims had died to fuel twisted experiments, but those experiments had inadvertently advanced medical knowledge in ways that would eventually save lives. It was the outcome Black had predicted, though not the vindication he had hoped for. He would forever be remembered as a monster, not a pioneer, his name spoken with revulsion rather than respect. Sarah Mitchell lived a long life, marrying a local shopkeeper and raising 4 children. She never fully recovered from her time in Black's care, suffering periodic health problems related to the damage his treatments had caused. But she survived, and she made sure her story was told, giving interviews to medical historians and writing a memoir that detailed both her ordeal and her recovery. She became an advocate for patient rights and medical oversight, her testimony instrumental in establishing stricter licensing requirements for physicians in Mississippi. Sheriff Thomas Haywood and Marshal Daniel Foster both received commendations for their work on the case. Haywood returned to quiet law enforcement in Coldwater, while Foster continued tracking medical criminals and fraudulent practitioners throughout the South. The 2 men maintained correspondence for years, occasionally sharing information about suspicious doctors or unusual patient deaths that might indicate another predator like Black operating in their jurisdictions. The house where Black had practiced in Coldwater stood empty for several years before being torn down. Local legend held that it was cursed, that Black's evil had soaked into the walls and floors. No one wanted to live there or use the property. Eventually, the land was purchased by the town and converted into a small park with a memorial stone bearing the names of Black's known victims. Sarah Mitchell attended the dedication ceremony, placing flowers at the base of the stone and speaking briefly about the importance of remembering those who had suffered. Eleanor Mitchell, Sarah's mother, never forgave herself for bringing her daughter to Black. She died in 1870, her health broken by guilt and grief despite Sarah's repeated assurances that she bore no blame. In her final days, Eleanor made Sarah promise to continue fighting for medical reform, to ensure that no other desperate family would be victimized by a predator wearing a physician's coat. Sarah kept that promise faithfully. The banned files of Jeremiah Black remained sealed for 50 years, locked away in archives accessible only to state medical officials. In 1917, as World War I generated renewed interest in trauma medicine and rapid treatment techniques, a researcher named Dr. Elizabeth Thornton successfully petitioned for limited access to the files. What she found horrified her, but also provided valuable historical context for understanding the evolution of medical ethics in America. Thornton's detailed analysis, published in a restricted medical journal, revealed the full scope of Black's activities. Between 1863 and his capture in 1867, he had treated approximately 200 patients across 7 states. Of those, 73 had died directly from his experimental procedures, while dozens more suffered lasting damage. The geographic range and systematic nature of his crimes suggested a level of organization and planning that had not been fully appreciated during his trial. More disturbing were Black's own projections, written in his journal just weeks before his capture. He had calculated that with proper resources and an established practice, he could process up to 50 patients annually, extracting enough biological materials to sustain his research indefinitely, while generating significant financial profit from selling his refined essences to wealthy clients seeking enhanced vitality. Black had envisioned creating a network of collaborators, other physicians willing to adopt his methods, transforming his individual crimes into an organized industry. Only his capture had prevented this nightmare from becoming reality. Thornton's work led to new protocols for medical research oversight and patient consent, establishing principles that would eventually evolve into modern bioethics standards. Black's case became a cautionary tale taught in medical schools, an example of how scientific curiosity without moral constraints could transform healing into harm. His name entered medical history alongside other notorious figures who had violated the physician's oath, a reminder of the darkness that could emerge when medicine served the practitioner's interests rather than the patient's welfare. In the 1930s, the last known survivors of Black's treatment passed away. Sarah Mitchell died in 1934 at age 91, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. In her final interview, given just months before her death, she reflected on her experience with remarkable clarity. Dr. Black believed he was pursuing knowledge, but he forgot that knowledge has no value if obtained through cruelty. She said, "True medicine requires compassion as much as skill. Without compassion, a doctor is just another kind of predator." The original journals were eventually transferred to the National Archives in Washington, where they remain under restricted access to this day. Researchers must provide compelling justification for viewing them, and even then, only heavily redacted versions are typically made available. The complete, unedited journals contain details too disturbing for general circulation, descriptions of procedures and observations that serve no legitimate educational purpose and would only gratify morbid curiosity. In Coldwater, Mississippi, the Park Memorial to Black's victims became a site of reflection and remembrance. Each year on the anniversary of Sarah Mitchell's rescue, locals gather to place flowers and renew their commitment to ethical medical practice and patient advocacy. Medical students from the state university sometimes visit to lay wreaths and contemplate the responsibilities their profession carries. The memorial's inscription reads simply, "Remember those who suffered. Honor them by doing better." The question of whether Black's research retained any legitimate scientific value remained controversial. Some argued that any knowledge derived from unethical experimentation should be rejected entirely, that using such information perpetuated the harm inflicted on victims by suggesting their suffering had served a purpose. Others contended that failing to learn from past horrors, however obtained, was itself wasteful and potentially harmful to future patients who might benefit from that knowledge. The debate continued across decades, with no clear resolution satisfying all perspectives. What remained undebatable was the human cost. 73 confirmed deaths, countless others damaged, families destroyed, and trust in medicine undermined across entire communities. Jeremiah Black's legacy was one of pain and betrayal, a stark demonstration of what happens when the pursuit of knowledge abandons ethical foundations. He had sought immortality through scientific achievement, but instead achieved infamy as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition. The last mention of Black in official records came in 1968, exactly 100 years after his execution, when the Mississippi State Medical Board voted to permanently seal his files from further research access. The decision followed debates about whether continued study of Black's work served any legitimate purpose or simply risked inspiring imitation. The board concluded that enough had been learned, enough lessons extracted, and that the time had come to let the past rest undisturbed. And so the banned files of Jeremiah Black remain locked away, a dark chapter in medical history that serves as both warning and reminder. The doctor who fed on his patients left behind no monument, no statue, no honor. He left only questions about how far medicine should go in pursuit of knowledge and how societies can protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them in science's name. His story, preserved in archives and memorials, stands as testament to the essential truth that healing must never become predation, and that the sacred trust between doctor and patient, once broken, echoes across generations with consequences that time cannot erase. In the end, Jeremiah Black got exactly what he deserved, to be remembered not for the knowledge he pursued but for the lives he destroyed in pursuing it. His name became synonymous with medical evil, his methods a baseline for what must never be allowed, and in that dark remembrance, perhaps, lies the only value his existence ever provided, a warning, written in blood and suffering, that some boundaries exist for reasons deeper than mere convention, and crossing them transforms the healer into the very disease he claims to fight. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.